Hello my fellow history geeks, or just people who like history. So in today's video, it's a different type of video. Today, if you have read the title of this video, then you know that this video is about a serial killer named Pedro Lopez. So just a little warning before the video start. There will be mention of child rape, child molesting, physical abuse, sexually assault, killing spree, mention of drugs, and mention kidnapping. So if you are not comfortable about these mentions, then I would recommend that you click off this video and watch something else that makes you happy and cozy. But if you do like to learn more about serial killers, then please keep watching. So, Pedro, he was born on 8th of October, 1948. He was born in Santa Isabel, Colombia. To his mother Benilda Lopez de Castaneda, and his father Magdardo Reyes. Pedro, he was the 7th of 13 children. That's a lot of kids. So his mother, Benilda. There are some sources say that she was a laundry worker, others say that she was a prostitute in a rough part of Colombia. She made poor choices, not only in regard to her profession, but also generally throughout her life. When she gave birth to Pedro, she would already have 6 children, and she would go on to have another 6 in quick succession, with most of them from different fathers. While his father was a member of the country's right-wing party. Unfortunately, he was murdered in La Violencia. The armed conflict of the era that would have repercussions for years to come. La Violencia was a 10-year civil war in Colombia. It was between the Colombian Conservative Party and the Colombian Liberal Party. They mainly fought in the countryside. The rural town police and political leaders encouraged the conservative supporting peasants to seize the agricultural lands of liberal supporting peasant violence throughout Colombia. La Violencia is estimated to have killed at least 200,000 people, which is almost 1 in 50 Colombians. That's a lot of people who got killed. The conflict continued to have a lasting impact, even after the fighting had slowed down, affecting all areas of the society, including the economy. Pedro did also experience a chaotic and often violent home life, where a procession of men meted out discipline to him, with a hard slap or sudden beating for no reason. He grew up covered with bruises, and not with love and affection. But despite this, he was described as a rather kind and polite child who had dreamed of becoming a teacher. There are also varying accounts as to why Pedro left his home as a young kid. There are some who claim that his mother had kicked him out, at the age of 8, after his mother caught Pedro molesting his younger sister. While there are others that say that he simply just ran away. But after he got kicked out, he was picked up by a man, where he would be taken to a deserted house and repeatedly sodomized. Whichever is true, he eventually found his way to Colombia's capital, which is Bogotá, where he lived on the streets among other homeless children. Just like many homeless youth in the area, Pedro joined a gang and he got involved with drugs. At one point, Pedro said a seemingly kind stranger had offered him a place to stay for the night, but unfortunately Pedro got sexually assaulted. When he was 10 years old, Pedro met an elderly couple who had offered to give him a home and enrolled him at a school for orphaned children. But unfortunately, Pedro's chance at a better life was once again destroyed when he, at the age of 12 years old, got molested by one of the school's teachers. He ran away from the school and went back to live out on the street. At this point, Pedro was broken, yet he hardened. He began to speak often of getting revenge for the pain that he had suffered as a child. His upbringing plays a role in the way that he was shaping as the monster that he would later become. His exposure to the violence, abandonment, and a lack of stable parental figures most likely contributed to his warped sense of morality and empathy. Which as a result, Pedro began to show signs of deviant behavior at an early age, which foreshadowed the darkness that would later consume him. When Pedro was 18 years old, he got arrested for stealing cars, and his first brush with the law marked the beginning of his criminal career. And upon his release, he took a life of petty crime, which eventually progressed into more serious offenses. It wasn't until the late 1960s that Pedro's crimes took a sinister turn. In 1969, he was arrested for the abduction and rape of a young girl. The incident marked the beginning of his transformation into a serial killer. Pedro was convicted and only served a few years in prison. Which is shockingly a light sentence despite his crime. When he got released, his homicidal tendencies began to manifest with alarming frequency. He soon became a nomadic predator, moving through South American countries, including Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. He would target young girls, primarily between the ages of 8 to 12 years old. He would lure them away with promises of money or gifts. He would typically approach young girls who were either alone, vulnerable, and often living in impoverished conditions. He would use his seemingly harmless demeanor and his charisma to gain their trust. Once he had gained their confidence, he would lead them to a secluded area, where he would sexually assault and strangle his victims. Pedro was known to mutilate some of his victims' bodies after their deaths, which added a gruesome element to his already horrific crimes. Even more disturbing was Pedro's apparent indifference to the suffering that he inflicted on his victims. He once boasted that he killed so many girls that he had lost count, and he would even show no remorse for his actions. His lack of empathy and his ability to compartmentalize his crimes are just chilling aspects of his personality. When Pedro got released from prison in 1978, he traveled to Peru with a newly acquired taste for blood. He had developed an intense hatred for his mother, and by proxy, other women, and a distorted objectification of women due to a porn addiction. This is all according to La Vanguardia. But instead of him targeting his mother or other adult women, he decided to start kidnapping and killing young girls in the Ayacucho region of Peru. Pedro would later explain that he had started by abducting girls from the nearby indigenous communities, especially those from the more remote areas. He would offer the young children gifts if they came along with him. He would specifically target the ones with a certain look of innocence. After he would lure a victim away from her loved ones and local community, Pedro explained, "I would take her to a secret hideaway where prepared graves waited. I cuddled them and then raped them at sunrise. At the first sign of light, I would get excited. I forced the girl into spicy time and put my hands around her throat. When the sun rose, I would strangle her. That's the most fucked up thing I have ever read in my entire life. I can't." He really is crazy. Pedro was delighted in watching a certain light go out in his victims' eyes, but his murderous rituals didn't end with the young girls' deaths. He would then go on and violate their dead bodies, before hiding or burying the corpses before he went after his next victims. He did also note that he never kidnapped or killed white girls, due to their parents were too watchful. Pedro would later claim that during this period in Peru, that he had murdered more than 100 girls between the ages of 7 to 13, which would eventually earn him the nickname of Monster of the Andes. This string of murders only came to a halt due to a group of Ayacucho's indigenous people who had discovered Pedro, as he was attempting to lure away a 9-year-old girl from their community. Pedro recalled his near-death experience. "Indians in Peru had me tied up and buried in sand to my neck when they found what I had been doing to their daughters. They had placed syrup on me and were going to let me be eaten by ants. But an American missionary lady came by in her jeep and promised them she would turn me over to the police. The Ayacuchos reluctantly agreed to let the woman take Pedro to the police. So they dug Pedro up and returned his belongings to him. But as Pedro and the American woman walked away, there are some accounts that say that she never handed him over to the police. There are other accounts that say that he did get handed over, but he managed to escape as he was being sent over to Ecuador. While in Ecuador, he would go on killing 3 young and innocent girls a week. He did also say, "I like the girls in Ecuador, they are more gentle and trusting, more innocent." The authorities had previously believed that the disappearance of so many girls was due to sexual slavery or prostitution. While in either case, Pedro was once again free, and his violent crimes continued. After he got deported from Peru, he resumed his killing spree, and although the authorities began to notice an increase of missing persons, and more specifically young girls, throughout the area that Pedro traveled, they could conclude that the disappearances were most likely cases of human trafficking. Pedro continued the murders and by the late 1970s had made his way to Ecuador, where scores of girls began to go missing as well. Family tried to find the girls on their own, with one mother putting ads in the newspapers about her missing daughter. In the late 1970s and 1980s, more and more young girls were disappearing as Pedro had moved on to Colombia and Ecuador. However, without any bodies, most of the police officers assumed that the disappearances were related to human trafficking or child runaways, and not a serial killer. When the flash flood happened in Ambada, Ecuador, 1979, the bodies of 4 of the missing children were uncovered and found. Just days later, Pedro attempted to abduct a 12-year-old, Maria Poveda, from a marketplace, which was also in Ambada, but failed when her mother caught him in the act with the help of another woman. He was almost lynched on the spot. He was rescued by police officers and was arrested while proclaiming that he was a good person and that he had a clean heart. While he was in detention, Pedro was subjected to a standard interrogation until he told the police officer that he was not Ecuadorian, but that he was a Colombian drifter. A police lieutenant then beat him and accused him of being a part of a gang abducting girls from Ambato. The officer then threatened to kill him and if he didn't confess. But Pedro remained silent. And in that moment, the officer's superior, Captain Pastor Cordova, entered the room and told all of the police officers to leave, where Captain Cordova decided to integrate Pedro himself, but with a more friendly approach. Captain Cordova, he offered Pedro food and cigarettes and asked him about his health and feelings, before requesting information about the gang of abductors. In April 1980, the areas surrounding Ambato, Ecuador were hit by flash flooding, unearthing the remains of several young girls who had been previously reported missing. This revelation prompted the police to reopen their investigation and contributed towards Pedro's ultimate arrest later that same year. On the 14th of June, 1980, police was in the mountain town of Ambato. They said that they have found 53 bodies of little girls who were raped and murdered by a man Ecuadorian. The newspapers had dubbed him the monster of the Andes. The police told Quito newspapers the bodies were found in shallow graves in the Andía provinces of Tungurahua, Cotopaxi, Chimborazo, Pichincha and Imbabura. Pedro was later identified as a 28-year-old Colombia, who has been in jail in Ambato, the capital of Tungurahua province about 75 miles or 120 kilometers south of Quito, since the first week of March. The police said that Lopez had confessed to killing the 53 young girls, and at least 50 others in Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru. Not long after the flooding had occurred, a local woman named Carvina Poveda. She was on her way to the market with her 12-year-old daughter, Marie. So Pedro attempted to abduct Marie. But the local merchants were able to overpower Pedro and hold him until the police arrived. Once he was in police custody, he initially refused to cooperate during his interrogation, choosing to remain silent. But eventually, he began to confess all of his crimes to the police captain Pastor Cordova. The police, they have been sneaky. And by that I mean, the police captain, he was placed inside the same cell as Pedro he was in. And while he was there, Pedro boasted that in total, he had murdered over 200 in Ecuador, some 10s in Peru, and many more in Colombia. He would describe his modus operandi as first luring the victim away from public spaces with a trinket, before he would rape them and strangle them with his bare hands. He additionally claimed that he would occasionally exhume the victims' bodies from their burial site and have tea parties with them. And when asked about his motive for the murders that he had committed, he answered, "I lost my innocence at age of 8. So I decided to do the same to as many girls as I could." He is really sick in the head for what he had done to those poor and innocent young little girls. I mean, come on. They are scared for the rest of their life. So, soon after his confession, he directed the authorities to the bodies of 53 victims, and his confessions soon led to the confirmation of a total of 110 in Ecuador. In 1980, Pedro was ultimately convicted for the murder of 110 people and sentenced to the maximum prison term allowed under the Ecuadorian law at the time. But unfortunately, that was only 16 years. And then, he was released 2 years early, in 1994, for good behavior, and deported back to Colombia. There, he was expected to face the firing squad for his crimes committed in that country, but the prosecutors were unable to make a case for it. His trial in Ecuador was a complex and highly publicized affair. The scale of his crimes and international attention they garnered placed immense pressure on the justice system to ensure he faced the harshest punishment possible. And, Pedro's case was presented numerous legal challenges. One of the most significant obstacles was the lack of concrete evidence in many of the murders that he had committed. Pedro's nomadic lifestyle made it difficult to link him to specific crimes, and the absence of forensic technology in many of the regions where he had committed his crimes only further complicated the matters. As a result, Pedro was initially charged with 110 counts of murder, a number that reflected only a fraction of his actual victims. Pedro's defense team attempted to portray him as mentally unstable, arguing that he should be declared insane and therefore he wasn't criminally responsible for his actions. And this legal maneuvering only added more complexity to an already convoluted case. Pedro served his prison sentence at the Garcia Moreno prison near Quito and was released from prison 2 years early, on August 31, 1994. He was summarily deported back to Colombia, where the authorities there attempted to convict him of a 2-decades-old murder. But instead, Pedro was declared insane, and in 1995, he was institutionalized in a psychiatric hospital. When he was interviewed just shortly before his release, Pedro described himself as the man of the century and said that he was being released for good behavior. After he got released, Pedro was deported to Colombia and was detained as an illegal immigrant upon his arrival, before he was being handed over to the Colombian authorities. The prosecutors were unable to make a case against him, and he was instead declared insane and was admitted into a mental hospital. In February 1998, Pedro was declared sane and was released under a $50 bail with the additional stipulations. He would visit his elderly mother, who said that he asked for his inheritance and then, upon being informed of her poverty, sold her sole bed and chair to people on the street. In 1999, Pedro gave an exclusive, one-time-only interview to National Examiner correspondent Ron Leitner. And this is his perspective of how he did manage to kidnap so many young and innocent girls. Pedro would brag that he was the man of the century. And that, no one will ever forget me. I mean, that's quite understandable. I mean, what he had done to the poor young girls. He did also say, I went after my victims by walking among the markets searching for a girl with a certain look on her face, a look of innocence and beauty. She would be a good girl, working with her mother. I would give her a trinket like a hand mirror, then take her to the edge of town where I would promise a trinket for her mother. And that, I would take her to a secret hideaway where prepared graves waited. Sometimes there were bodies of earlier victims there. I cuddled them and then raped them at sunrise. At the first sign of light, I would get excited. I forced the girl into sex and put my hands around her throat. When the sun rose, I would strangle her. That's really messed up. I mean, just this whole story is just really messed up. It was only good if I could see her eyes, it would have been wasted in the dark, I had to watch them in daylight. There is a divine moment when I have my hands around a girl's throat. I look into her eyes and see a certain light, a spark, suddenly go out. The moment of death is enthralling and exciting. Only those who actually kill know what I mean. It took the girls 5 to 15 minutes to die. I was very considerate. I would spend a long time with them making sure they were dead. I would mirror to check whether they were still breathing. Sometimes I had to kill them all over again. They never screamed because they didn't expect anything would happen. They were innocent. I would link the text version of the interview in the description down below. Just a few years later, in 2002, the Interpol issued a new warrant for Pedro's arrest in connection with a new murder case. But the last time he was seen out in public was back in 1999, when he was renewing his citizenship card in Bogota. But there are some rumors saying that he is currently living in Tolima department in Colombia as a homeless man. But we don't know if it's true or not. On one hand, I feel bad about what Pedro had been through. I mean, his upbringing and how he got disciplined by the men and his mother had brought home. I mean, it's quite common with serial killers, that they had bad childhoods, and they had been through some kind of abuse. I don't mean that if you have or had been abused that you will end up as a serial killer, it's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that there is kinda more to it, before a serial killer becomes a serial killer. There are early warning signs. Like they start killing innocent animals, like squirrels, birds or other small animals. Then it would evolve over time. I do also feel bad for what the families had been through, that he had kidnapped and whatnot they must have been through. You know. It's sad too. From the bottom of my heart, thanks for watching this week's video. And if you are in an abusive relationship, then please call 1888, it's a hotline that provides assistance for all types of domestic violence and rape. It's a national hotline. And I know that it's not easy to get out of an abusive relationship. But if you are able to, then please get help.